Hi, my name is Nora Gelprin. I work at Advocates for Youth. Thanks for joining me as we review Adapting Lesson Plans to be Affirming of LGBTQ plus Youth. A lot of people ask me why we need to adapt our lesson plans for this particular population. One of the easiest things to keep in mind is that it's because our job requires us to make our learning spaces safe for all of our students, not just some of our students. And that upwards of 8% of US high school students, according to the most recent data, have this identity. And we've seen those statistics really shift as the years go on. More and more millennials say that they don't identify as heterosexual. And it's important in schools in particular, according to the GLSEN 2015 National School Climate Survey. We really recognize that many of these students feel unsafe at school. Many of them, vast majority, have experienced verbal harassment, and as a result, they're much more likely to skip school, have a lower grade point average, and feel less self esteem compared to their heterosexual peers. We also know this really extends into more and more young people who identify as lesbian, gay, or bisexual in this particular data. Also, then feeling sad or hopeless, 40% of them considering suicide, and a full 30% having attempted suicide. Really unacceptable. We need to do more and better to support these young people. There's been call to actions for more inclusive sex education, and that's one of the things that we'll really be looking at in detail, how we as an individual educator could do that with our own specific lesson plans. Even if you're in a district or an area that's much more conservative, or perhaps you don't have enumerated policies or detailed health standards that require you to do this, there's some really simple, easy things that every teacher can do. Fortunately, we've fallen into some bad habits as outlined by Dr. Elizabeth Schroeder. One is we tend to only talk about how hard it is to be lesbian, gay, bisexual, or queer, when really we should acknowledge that challenge and extra roadblocks and barriers, but also affirm that it's really positive for many, many people. We also really think if we just put in some gender neutral names, if I call the characters Lee and Lee, I'm good, right? When really that's a really good first step, but we need to take one step further and make sure that we affirm lesbian, gay, bisexual, queer couples and in our scenarios and in our lesson plans. We'll show you how to do that a little bit more in detail. We also generally just have one standalone lesson on maybe a unit in sexuality, when really it would be ideal to weave folks with these identities into every lesson that we've got. We shouldn't assume that all of our students are heterosexual unless notified otherwise, but really assume that most of our students, fully half of our students from our most recent data, really say that they have an identity that's more reflective on a spectrum than in specific categories. And really, we want to keep intersectionality in mind, really meaning the complex and cumulative manner in which the effects of different forms of discrimination combine, overlap, and intersect. Thanks to the great work of Kimberly Crenshaw, who coined this term for us and this concept, we need to keep in mind that people are never just one identity, but multiple identities, and the intersection of those identities really can result in complex and different forms of oppression. So, how do we do this? How do we change our lesson plans to be more affirming of our students with these identities? So, these are some really straightforward and concrete ways to do this. Such things as making sure when we talk about sexual orientation that we have definitions related to attraction and less around behavior. Make sure that we talk about the range of sexual orientations, including heterosexuality and even asexuality. Make sure that we separate out someone's decisions about their behavior from their feelings of attraction, because we know their decisions can really be impacted by homophobia. We can also look at our lesson plans, really doing like a quick scan to look at those scenarios and topics and make sure that those are relevant for lesbian, gay, bisexual, and queer plus identities in our classroom. Making sure to look for yellow flag terms such as lifestyle, preference, or choice, which would really never be the preferred language to be using. And make sure you show positive examples of lesbian, gay, bisexual, and queer people and their families in your lesson plans, again, to not always focus just on the negative. Other ideas are to include different resources, both in the school community as well as in the larger community. Make sure to identify adults that are safe in the school community and larger community for LGBTQ young people to be in touch with and to talk to. And that make sure that even students that identify as heterosexual acknowledge that many of them have friends and family member with these identities, to make sure that those folks are not rendered invisible in our work either. So let's dig in and practice with a couple of scenarios. So here's an original scenario from a very popular abstinence only until marriage program. You can read it for yourself what the assignment is. And an easy way to adapt this scenario to be more inclusive would be to do something like this. Make it much more simple, really just focus on the criteria, which is the crux of the assignment anyway, and to really just talk about that they would like to go out together. That's all that you really need to focus in on. You don't need to gender it or put in sexual orientations. Another example from a common sex ed lesson plan, really thinking about how they can talk to each other about risk around pregnancy and STDs. And if we were to make it more inclusive, we'd just drop the guy and the girl and just say it's two people dating. They really like each other. They want to show each other affection. So it's really simple, just some changes in pronouns, some slight edits to some of the grammar, and you've made that scenario much more inclusive and more people can see themselves in it. Lastly, here's a scenario that we could make much more affirming. You'll see that it starts with a guy and a girl. They've been dating for 3 months. One is seeing the other talk to somebody else and getting jealous. But how about we make this specifically around a lesbian couple? So, two girls, and really give them names and really lean into what that relationship would look like. And talking about how issues of jealousy come up in these kinds of relationships, just like they do in heterosexual relationships. So, to not only be inclusive, but then to take the next step and be affirming as well. So, in summary, it's really important that we make sure our lesson plans reflect the full range of sexual orientations in our schools and in our communities. It's important that we check on what our district and our state policies are to make sure that these adaptations are not going to violate any of those policies. And we know there are really simple things that we as individual educators can do to our lesson plans to make sure that all of our students see themselves reflected in our teaching and feel safe learning in our classrooms. So thanks so much for joining me today on this quick review. We hope you have found it helpful.